Hello and welcome back to Freedom Philosophy TV. I've had a little bit of a break. I've got a new camera and some new production software, so there's been some fair changes here. I'm learning to make videos with the new software. I've also put up a new blog site at freedomphilosophy.tv where I'll be able to join together all my programs and also do regular blog posts, and people will be able to engage in comment and discussion there. And I'm hoping that will help build up the popularity of the channel. Today I was looking at a group on the internet. It was a Facebook group, and somebody called Robert Anaya asked some fairly classic questions of the Stateless Society, and I'd like to answer those questions fully or more fully than I did in the group, and I'll put a connection below to the group if you want to go and have a look. So these are questions about what would happen if we weren't in a stateless society. Now I'd like to sort of have a preamble to this these kind of questions and point out that the development of the central state or government is quite a late thing in human history. Many societies for thousands of years did not have governments, and by no means were all those societies primitive. Many of them were advanced in their development of a civic society with different roles for different people. So we're not just talking about everyone being kind of primitive tribesmen with spears and mud huts. There was actually advanced, relatively advanced civilizations that were stateless, and this is true of the Celts, and was true across Europe prior to the advent of invading states like the Romans, for example. So anyway, let's get on with the questions. So number one is, who takes care of infrastructure? And this is the classic what about the roads question. And so let's just have a think about what it's like at present in the state or government run road system. Quite often roads aren't in a good state of repair. I mean, that's particularly true in the neighbourhood I live in. There's potholes, there's rough patches, and things can be quite untidy and unclean as well. So it's not necessarily a very good solution, the one we have. And then also there's the issue of pricing, because what's happened with the socialisation of the road building programme is that what used to primarily be an expense to the merchant class and to the business classes, they had to pay for and provide roads to transport their goods for sale and to transport materials for construction. What's happened is that cost has been spread out to the general population in a much more even way and in a much less fair way. So for example, if you're shifting loads of food, or you're importing or moving into your factory place a lot of steel, the lorries and other vehicles you're using to do that transporting, they only pay, like in this country, a fee proportional to the size of the vehicle. So it's not reflected the number of journeys and the amount of wear and tear the vehicles make on the road. So effectively, the ordinary people who use the road, and maybe not often at all, are actually funding at a far higher degree the cost of production and distribution. So it's actually quite an unfair system, although more people do have access to road and transport. The tax burden probably isn't proportionate or fair. So to answer the question then, what happened before the road socialisation? Well, really, they were prior to the state. Like I said before, it was the merchant classes who paid for the roads and disproportionately bore the costs of that process. And an example of this would be, and I often talk about this, ancient Ireland. They had quite a for the time advanced infrastructure, roads and bridges, and travelling was relatively easy for the time. Now, merchants aren't the only people who like constructing roads, because it obviously it reduces their costs and time to deliver goods. Also, of course, local people do actually want to have roads and can be engaged in a mutually agreeable level of input to the construction and providing the infrastructure. And obviously, people will create footpaths merely by walking up and down unowned land and so forth. And then of course there's the whole thing of the fact that the state, as it is now, actually hires typically private contractors. So road construction isn't fully nationalised. It is a process done by companies with the special engineering skills. So really, I think all the answers are there already. And also I think the free market historically can be demonstrated to show a fairer and more socially fair and agreeable solution to the problem. And one last thing about the roads is the state is very interested in developing and having public roads for another reason, and that was typically to move troops or warriors, of course, historically, to places of conflict, to suppress dissent and uprisings. So it's worth realising that the public road infrastructure is also, in the way it is, a tool of oppression. And another negative side effect of the socialisation of the price of roads is, of course, pollution, because once the cost or the burden is shared unfairly, once you take away what would exist in the private market, which would be toll roads, there's a disproportionate cost of polluting. So the polluter doesn't pay, basically, because the tax doesn't necessarily reflect the amount of travel done. And obviously there's high duties on fuel and tax on fuel, so there is an element of that. But toll roads would add on top of that, where they would be additional or would take over that role. So there actually could be some very dramatic changes for the better around pollution, and I'm talking about noise pollution as well as toxic fume pollution in a society where the roads were privately owned. Question number 2, who prevents monopolies? Well, of course, the government is a monopoly. It's a monopoly on the legal system and legislation and the control of the population. It's a violent, coercive agency that derives income through acts of extortion. So you can't really have the government eliminating monopolies, given that it is a monopoly. And the government really is a monopoly of the worst kind. It's criminal. It empirically has a long history of conquest and violence, and bloodletting and oppressive laws and so on and so forth. Society was much more liberal and much freer without the state being in place, and obviously one could talk about the extremes of primitive cultures and so on and so forth. But in general, I think societies where there was no government were freer places, and to answer the question more specifically, competition in the free market tends to limit the ability of monopolies to form. In fact, I would say pretty much the only reason why monopolies form is because of privileges that are created through the state and the government making legislation. Without those privileges, what you have is anyone else being able to come along and see a better way of doing something, and then potentially if it is better and people agree, then the capital can be raised and a new business can start off and can compete. And I think we see that tendency goes on in the free market, and even with government protections and restrictions and regulations in places, still innovation turns up and smashes monopolies. And there's a great example of that now in the sort of the lift sharing disruptive technology that's come up through mobile phones, and it's challenging the taxi service, which of course the regulated taxi service is a monopoly which is granted by the state, and the free market and technology enable these monopolies to be challenged. And this is going on all the time, even with all the protections of the state. Number 3, this is a huge one as well. Who settles disputes? I've talked quite frequently in my series of programs about the Brehon law, and about in general the law about with the Celts, and customary law, Zia law. So private courts can address legal disputes, and of course there's a whole lot of social structure behind these systems that need to be in place and understood. But spontaneously, these have arisen spontaneously in free societies or stateless societies. And the other thing to say is that actually the government's not very good at settling disputes. Lawyers and all these experts that are involved in interpreting the law, it's an incredibly expensive process. Can be very time consuming. People can wait for years for judgments. And really, I would say that the whole government legislation and legal system is just one of the worst rackets. Again, because it's a monopoly, there's no redress, there's no alternative. So really, I don't think it's a very good system at all. So I think question 3, although it's a very good question, is probably not one of the best examples to pick of where the state provides a solution. Number 4, who enforces personal property disputes and infringements? Well, again, this comes down to the private market offering mediation and a court system. And as for the enforcement, that can be done personally by the individual. So, for example, I can put locks on my doors, my windows, I can put up barbed wire fencing. I could employ a guard, and they could have a gun, and of course all these things are still happening to some degree in the world it is at present, even though we have a socialised police force. And then we have the possibility for these courts. And how would the courts enforce? Well, typically again we go back to the Brehon law. Courts enforce through fines, and everyone pays into a communal pool or has a bond, which can be basically forfeit in order to remunerate claimants. So these again are all systems that were very advanced in stateless societies such as ancient Ireland, and they were working solutions, and I think better again than the government solutions, which are really just become a racket for whoever provides the so-called service, and invariably those services are very poor and get worse, and there's no redress because there's no competition, and there really tends to be a lack of justice and good service to the clients. Number 5, what keeps other countries who are not liberty-loving from taking aggressive action towards a country with presumably no borders? Well, there's actually quite a few questions in there. Obviously, having a government doesn't protect you against other aggressive states or pacts. I mean, having a government didn't help the French particularly stay free from the German aggression during World War II. Similar for Poland, it had an army, but it just wasn't adequate. I mean, against a greater and more violent and well-armed aggressor, there's not really much you can do, and having a government is not a necessary solution to the problem. I think weapons technology is a big part of this. I think anywhere with a nuclear deterrent would be particularly effective at deterring a foreign nation from aggression. But then individual acts of terrorism and so forth are somewhat more challenging to deal with. I think having a good infrastructure, a secure infrastructure would really help that. And I'd refer there back to the roads thing and the way that governments have these big public road networks. They are great for moving things about freely and easily, so that the government can get troops places. But there's always the other side of it, that without private ownership and lots of like cellular areas of private property with gates and guards, you're also actually opening up your society to more easy invasion, so that troops can overwhelm a particular weak point and then move very quickly through a land and invade. So that's really kind of about the road systems and private property. Then there's the possibility for having private militias. In tribal societies, again we're going back to ancient Ireland, the different sort of tribal units had a militia, and they did have some sort of higher level management of those militias, but it was all voluntary. It was democratic, and so on and so forth. So you can have a very effective militia. So we've got the weapons systems there. That's kind of crucial. If you're outgunned, it doesn't matter whether or not you have a government. Potentially you're going to be beaten. And as for the borders thing, well, I've kind of pointed towards that. A society with a private property is much more likely to have a more cellular kind of structure to it, with areas that are gated and secured with guards, private toll roads, and so on and so forth. And also there's another point here, that a government with a social infrastructure of oppression already in place lends itself to being invaded and taken over. And you saw this historically. For example, the Romans couldn't manage, despite superior technology and military power, couldn't manage to take over Scotland, for example. I think it was the Picts in Scotland. And similarly, I don't think the Romans even tried to take the Irish on either, because there wasn't the infrastructure there to immediately oppress those populations. And again, they were very aggressive, they were well armed, and they were prepared to fight for their freedom, which is another factor. So point 6, if everyone is taking care of themselves, who takes care of those who can't care for themselves, etc., etc. But what if charity is not enough, and so on. Well, if we go back again to the ancient Irish, or to many tribal societies, it was the family who were responsible for their members, parents for children, grandfathers, grandparents for children, and children of children. And again, they all paid a bond, a common bond for the family and for the tribal unit. So there was money set aside to solve exactly these kind of social problems, and they had individual accountability. What we see in the state system is that the social or the welfare system tends to take away or undermine personal responsibility, and you see quite crazy and unwell people on the streets. They harass people. It makes people feel insecure. And so on and so forth. So I don't think this is something that the state has really addressed particularly well, and I think it is an issue of personal responsibility, and there are solutions there, and they were there before. They were sort of fellowships and societies, friendly societies that people contributed their income to regularly and provided a social security net. So that's the solution to number 6. Number 7 is commerce to be run on a barter system, and if there is in fact money, who administers it and what makes it viable in another society? Well, for centuries money was in the private market and banking too, and I'll probably post some links under here to some documents you can read about this. The state taking over and centralising the money supply really has been very disastrous. The false setting of low interest rates feeds cycles of boom and bust, and allocates resources inefficiently. So there's a lot to be said about the dangers of central banking. And as for private banks, they're kind of self-limiting. They can't lend what they haven't got. The people who create the bank need to be able to back low. If they overlend, they need to be able to be accountable in a court of law because the losses of the bank can be discounted against the value of the banking partnership. So they would lose their homes, their private assets at risk in a private bank in ways which really a socialised and government-backed banking system is dysfunctional and ineffective, and then you get these taxpayer bailouts, which is, I think, just insanely corrupt and bad for business. Number 8, pollution control. I've kind of touched on this already in talking about roads and the socialisation of roads. Having toll roads would hugely reduce the amount of pollution, for example, from vehicular traffic, I believe. And another thing is that the governments have actually passed legislation to make it legally okay to pollute. I mean, if you go to China, for example, it's full of pollution, and the government lets this go, and it's possible because the most polluted areas are, of course, common public places like rivers, and because there isn't private ownership, there's no legal redress for that pollution, or it's very difficult. And again, because the state has a monopoly on the legal system, it will flex it in ways to favour polluters. And I think, for example, historically in the USA, when the railroad companies were doing a lot of construction, there was a lot of filth and muck falling on people's homes and on their washing that was out in the yard. And initially people were making lots of civil claims, and then the polluters had to improve their locomotives by putting sort of special boxes on the chimneys and so forth. So that in the private market, in the private civil cases where there is legal redress, the polluter will be held to account in I think ways which polluters actually get away with things at the moment. So I actually am quite positive about pollution in the free market, and I think you'll see all the worst examples of polluting societies are the ones with governments, and the stronger and more powerful those governments, like in China, then I think you'll see the worst examples of pollution. So thanks for listening in. I hope you found these answers helpful and insightful, and do check out the links below, and of course spread the word. If you like this program, share it and let other people know. Bye.